All right, cool. Yeah. Like they said, my name's Corey Overstreet. I'm a senior security consultant here at Red Siege. Uh, Name of the talk today, like I said, Recon 101, huge needles, small haystack. So this is going to be a talk covering a lot of the reconnaissance steps that we do when we're doing an external pen test or a red team. So a little bit about me. I've got 12 years in IT. 7 of those years were in security. I'm into music, play a lot of retro games, tinker with stuff. Pretty much all the electronics in my house are broken at some point. So, overview on the talk here. We cover 2 kinds of recon. So, there's passive recon and there's active recon. With passive recon, we're leaving little to no trace of our activities. This would be used in open source intelligence, such as things you can find on search engines or other services that aggregate all of this information. But all of this definitely falls into the passive recon. We're not sending any traffic to the target. Automated OSINT is usually pretty quiet, but depending on how they interact with DNS servers or discovered domains, it can kind of start moving into the active recon. Especially if you're just really hammering their DNS servers trying to brute force subdomain names. And then there's active recon. So this is anything you're doing where you're interacting with the target services when you're looking for, what kinds of things are available on the infrastructure that they're presenting externally. So we'll start off with OSINT on infrastructure. This would be looking for any services that they use, such as services that they host themselves, third-party services that are involved with them, and we look at a history of the host or DNS records that they may have had in the past. So usually the first place we start, we're going to start on Wikipedia. We're going to be looking at mergers and acquisitions. We're going to be looking for legacy infrastructure that may not be supported, may also be something that they've just kind of forgot is still out there. And these are also things that they may have inherited during one of the mergers and acquisitions. And then we'll be looking for domain names. A lot of times these domain names will give away, they'll give away what kind of services they're offering. They may also kind of hint at any kind of services that we should be focusing on during the active phase of testing. So after we go through Wikipedia, usually we'll get some kind of domain name from there. We go to DNS Dumpster. This service is amazing. They not only do they show all of the different DNS records that an organization may have, but they also offer services paid that we'll talk about a little bit later, where you can do a little more active testing against the host and proxy it away from your IP address. So the things we're looking for on here, we're looking at the mail exchange records. A lot of times these will give away spam or malware filters. So when we get to the phishing phase, we'll know kind of what we're up against, what kind of hoops we're going to have to jump through to get a phishing email to land in their inbox. We're also looking for the ASNs. These are the net blocks. These would be, if a company owns an entire range of IP addresses, now we've kind of narrowed down a lot of the places where we need to look when we're looking for external services that they may have. And then, of course, we look at the A records. This shows the IP addresses and subdomains. And again, this can also kind of give us an idea of what kind of ISP they're on, where we can rule out ISP equipment that's in their net block versus things that, they are hosting themselves and things that we should be able to go after that are in scope. All right. Yeah, so where we left off, after DNS Dumpster, we usually go to the Hurricane Electric BGP Toolkit. This company keeps kind of a record of, you can search by ASN, you can search by IP address, you can search by domain name. And once you search through this, everything is linked together. So there'll be clickable links on each of the resources that you find, which will take you kind of further down the rabbit hole. And they also keep a DNS history. So this can reveal previous domain names. We had a red team a couple years ago where we found the company's domain name, started profiling employees' names, built up a huge list, realized they were using Office 365. So we started trying to spray to find valid email addresses, but everything was coming back as invalid. So we started digging through DNS Dumpster and Hurricane Electric BGP and found a domain name in the DNS history that had previously been on one of their main IP addresses. So we started kind of digging in and making sure that this company, was owned by the target. And when we went back and changed the email domain to the domain that we found on the BGP toolkit, pretty much everything we had found, all of the valid employee names started coming back as valid email addresses. So that was hugely helpful when we were doing recon. So next, of course, we go to Shodan. Shodan is a huge search engine for devices on the internet. You can get anything from open ports. Usually these port scans are up to date. Not only does it reveal valid services that they're hosting, but Shodan also records the service headers that are returned. So you can kind of get a good idea a lot of times of the software version that's in use. Or any kind of error messages that indicate that they're doing like IP allow listing. And it also stores the SSL certificate information. So a lot of times these SSL certificates can help during the phishing campaign. So let's say that they're using outdated SSL certificates or something that's invalid, like a self-signed certificate. We can stand up a service that's also using a self-signed certificate, and the users will be so used to accepting those SSL certificate errors that they might just blow right past the SSL warning and not realize that they're interacting with our services that we stood up. And another good feature is IP address geolocation. So you can use this to determine if the devices that you're finding in the net blocks are owned by the company, they're owned by an ISP or a third party. Also, you can start to figure out which of their DNS records are pointing to services that have moved into the cloud. Because you kind of start getting into scope creep whenever you're looking at these things. During a red team, that may not be as big of a deal, but if you are on a pretty strict penetration test, then that can be hugely helpful. So kind of going back to the SSL certificate search, another couple of services that can go through these are census.io and cert.sh. With these services, you can also see what kind of services that they're securing. You can also find expired certs that may have been associated with hosts that they've decommissioned. Again, giving away more information about what kind of services that they originally had, what things that they've migrated to. And again, with the expired certs, you can use this in social engineering attacks. Like I said before, once the user becomes kind of desensitized to clicking through these certificate errors, they may not think twice about clicking through the warnings on your site and treating the malicious site as valid. Also, on these certificates, a lot of times if they're securing multiple services on their infrastructure, but it's not a wildcard, you can glean a lot of subdomain names from these certificates. All right, so Spy on Web. This is a domain history website. A lot of times you can look at DNS history by IP address or by domain name, and you can find previously owned domains. There again, the red team I was talking about earlier, we had a target that had rebranded, and they had acquired something like 35 or 36 companies over the last 10 years. We started going back through the recon steps on each of the newly discovered domains. What was really interesting was once we landed inside their network, we started finding Active Directory domains that were still tied to those legacy domains we found externally. Once we started moving laterally through their network, we managed to move into the areas that our point of contact actually didn't have control over because they were still managed by a legacy IT department outside of their control. The great thing about this was even when we were kicked out of the network on the domains that they were watching, we still had a way back in because we had a backdoor on a domain outside of their purview. So with Spy on Web, the whole reason we found those domains and started going after what ended up being a password reset function external, we were able to find all kinds of AD domains once we got inside because we knew what to look for that we had found externally. All right, so another great website is archive.org. This is the Wayback Machine. They often have complete moment in time copies of a site. They can be downloaded and searched for attack surface, and you can also host these on phishing domains. So there are tools to download those complete moment in time captures of a site. You take that, you stand it up on a site, you get it categorized the exact same as the company that you're going after. Let's say they're in finance. You try to get it categorized as finance. Then you stand that up on your phishing domain. Once it's categorized, you can take that stuff down and then stand up whatever you want, and that categorization will follow what you had. So that way, if they are filtering on websites such as, like this has been categorized as commerce instead of finance, once you have it categorized correctly, you're more likely to get interaction through the links that you send in your phishing campaigns. And then, like I said earlier, you can also stand this up on a personal web server and see if you can find things like cross-site scripting or other errors that may give you a foothold on the host or on the target, rather. All right, and then another thing we look for are job listings. We go to Google, Glassdoor, Indeed, Monster, ZipRecruit, any website that hosts job postings for this company, or may have historical job postings that they've put up. These often contain blue team technology like antivirus, EDR, malware, spam filters. They also may talk about operating systems in use, such as Windows, Mac, Linux, and the programming languages that they use for their web applications. With this information, once you land in the environment, you know what you're going to be up against, or have a pretty decent idea. But two, you also kind of know what they're looking at as far as their perimeter, what kind of services and what kind of protections may be in place. So these are often worth their weight in gold to go through. So the next, once we've kind of exhausted all of the infrastructure, OSINT and Recon that we can do, we start looking at employees. We're looking for employee names, email addresses, anything that would aid us in social engineering efforts, such as phone numbers, contact information, help desk phone numbers, those kinds of things. And again, we start at Wikipedia. The first thing we're looking for are usually the C-levels, the board members, etc. Usually these guys are out of scope. So, the last thing you want to be doing is sending phishing emails or pretext calls to the CEO. We're also looking for recent awards and recognition. Companies love to talk about their the things that they've done for the community, but we can also use these for phishing pretexts. Very commonly, when they raise money for charity, if we are trying to come up with a pretext to target the employees, we'll reference that whatever announcement that they had and say, "Hey, we're throwing a banquet for you guys. Just you got to click here to RSVP for the banquet." Things like that. And then we also look for the company history. So are these guys, have they been around for 100 years? Have they been around for 3? Were they acquired? Have they acquired a lot of companies? Because a lot of times too, once you start finding what kind of services they're using with that company history, you can pose as their IT team saying, "Hey, we're trying to migrate to this service that we know you guys use. We need you to run this updater so that we can make sure you're in compliance with the company." All right, next slide. All right, so with Hunter.io, this company constantly searches for contact information within a target organization. The great things you can pull from this site are the email address format that's in use. They determine this by the most common email format that they see. You can also pull just straight email addresses, and you can get employee names. Occasionally, you can get the title and phone number. So again, Once you have, so-and-so's title and phone number, you can call the front desk and be like, hey, I need to be transferred to this person, to kind of hide your phone call coming in. But you're also, that this person is more likely a manager because you found this on hunter.io. So again, you can use this to kind of start building your pretext for when you're trying to gain access. Next place, of course, is LinkedIn. Huge wealth of information. Some tools that we commonly use to scan LinkedIn, we use LinkedIn. This scans LinkedIn for employee names and title. This tool works great, but LinkedIn has kind of caught on to this. So a lot of times, unless you have connections with your Puppet account to employees in that organization, you're going to get back a lot of just generic info. But there are still a lot of LinkedIn accounts that their information is public, and you can still start pulling headshots. You can pull email addresses. You can pull their name, their title, those kinds of things. Another cool tool written by Justin Angel at Black Hills is Peasant. It has similar functionality to LinkedIn, but what it can also do is you can blanket a target organization with connection requests. And then after your Puppet account starts connecting with all these people at the target organization, you can rerun things like LinkedIn or Peasant, and you'll get a lot more results and a lot more valid account information. And then the final tool that we use is Gather Contacts. This is a Burp add-on. All you have to do is proxy your web browser through Burp and just do searches for the company name, and you restrict it to the site of linkedin.com. And what will happen is all of the accounts and that are linked to a certain company will be indexed by search engines like Google or Bing. And it'll actually spit out a CSV of the employee name, the organization where they work, their title. Sometimes you get phone numbers, and then any relevant information. Sometimes you can actually get information about things that they may have posted along with the company. And then the next thing we look through is public breach data. This is going to be any kind of exposures, such as password database leaks, that kind of thing. We go through, have I been pwned, dehashed, paste bin. There's torrents of legacy data out there. But the things we're looking for typically are email addresses and potential passwords. Now, most of the time, companies are up to date on passwords that have been breached. They make their employees change them, and then they move on. However, if you start seeing password patterns, a lot of times that kind of gives you a leg up on what you need to be spraying against their external services. Even though, that LinkedIn dump from 2014, of course, those people are not using those same passwords most of the time. You can still glean a lot of information from the stuff that's contained in those public breaches. Okay, so then, once we've kind of exhausted all of the manual open source intelligence gathering, we move on to automated OSINT. Again, this can find a lot of things that you may have missed with other tools, but they definitely still have their place in the Recon methodology. So the first tool that we go for is the Harvester. It searches through a ton of sources. You can do open source intelligence on both infrastructure and employees. It searches through all kinds of things, like stuff that's been indexed by Google and Bing. And it also looks at LinkedIn, looks for subdomains. Very few API keys are needed. You can go with no API keys if you like, but your results become a lot more in depth once you start getting API keys for the services. Excuse me. But it's pretty much set and forget. You just point it at a domain, let it do its thing, and take the results. But now, one thing I will say is very often this will get blocked by Google because they're watching for bots scanning through their search engine. So I would highly, highly recommend you scan through something like a DigitalOcean droplet or a Linode instance. Just so that your home IP address doesn't get blocked during these scans. Another tool is Amass. It's highly configurable. Takes a ton of API keys for a ton of different services. but this is mainly looking for infrastructure results. It can do subdomain brute forcing. It can also look through, excuse me, um, and it can also look through, you give it an ASN or a net block, and it will go through and tell you everything that's related to your target. So you can keep it completely passive where it never sends any packets to the target, or you can just let it do a mix of both so that it's so that it's also going after or interacting directly with the target through, say, their DNS services. And then the final tool that we use for automated OSINT is Recon NG. It's a modular OSINT framework, very similar to Metasploit in the way the command line works. But the cool thing about it is it's set up with a marketplace. So anytime you create an OSINT module for Recon NG, you can just put it out into the marketplace and now everyone can use it. But you can also create your own modules. You don't have to share everything that you create. And it can also generate formatted reports. So a lot of times, these tools give you back just this long laundry list of results. But when you try to hand that to a client, they're like, I don't know what to do with all this. So you can actually create formatted reports that look like something you would hand out during a debrief call to kind of get the non-technical people up to speed on what you were finding. And then it also is very scriptable. And what's great about the scripting engine is, let's say we tell it to go to DNS Dumpster first, it pulls down all these IP addresses. Those results actually feed into the next step for the script that you write. So it'll feed into going to the next service that you tell it to go to and the next. And by the end of it, you've got just a huge wealth of information that's usually on point because of the modular nature. You can tell it, I only want to search these services and only pull results from these places. But again, with the automated stuff, you got to be careful that you do start creeping into the active recon. So if you have a blue team who's really on their toes, they can start catching on to, okay, we've either got a pen test going on or we've got something serious coming. So it's good to make sure you kind of test these things offline to make sure you're not giving away too much information by the scans. And then the final phase of recon is the active recon. Once we build a huge profile of the target, we can start ramping up to light interactions with the target. We're not trying to tip them off that we're interacting with them. We're normally just trying to look like either a bot on the internet or just an everyday user who's interacting with their services. So the first tool, Eyewitness, this was written by Chris Trunser over at 40 North Security. It's an awesome tool. Basically, Python command line. You just point it at a target with a list of subdomains that you found during previous recon. And it'll go through and check for web, VNC, RDP services, but it includes all of the HTTP headers and screenshots of the service. So kind of at a glance, as you're going through the report, once it spits it out, you can kind of tell, okay, great, I just saw Tomcat on the internet. This is definitely somewhere where I need to be looking first. Or, you grab those screenshots for domains that you didn't necessarily have a subdomain for. Now okay, cool. This is their VMware authentication portal. Here's their Citrix portal. You're looking for the points of ingress that you'll be focusing on when you do start ramping up your attacks later. But another great feature of Eyewitness is you can take a Nessus output file or an Nmap XML file and feed it straight to it, and it'll do the rest. It'll parse out everything it needs, automatically figure out what services it needs and what ports to scan on. And then, like I said earlier, it spits out a formatted report, pretty simple HTML that's real easy to scroll through. Another great thing is he also keeps a database of default credentials for services. Once all the results have been parsed, it will go through and it'll say like, okay, we found Tomcat. Now here's the default creds to try here if you can get to the login screen. We use this a lot on internal pen tests as well, but for the sake of recon, this tool is awesome. Another thing that seems to kind of blow a lot of our clients away is just how much is contained within file metadata for files that they've shared online. Uh, Almost every external test that we have, we find usernames, email addresses, the operating system that the document was created on, also the software suites that are used to create the file. So a lot of times we can tell if they're using Office 365 versus just standalone Office on their computers. We can tell if they're using MacBooks or excuse me, Mac OS or Windows. But the usernames are often disclosed not just through the author name, but through the file path that the file was originally saved at. So let's say they created it on Windows. You can see the file path where it'll say C:/user/ whatever their username format is. And now you have at least one username that you can kind of infer the format from. So when you start getting into looking at services like if you find NTLM authentication endpoints online, things like that, you now have a username format that you can create brute force lists from. 90% of the time, first initial, last name. But I have had clients who use special codes like 2 letters and 5 numbers. But things like that, like I had a bank recently who they used 3 letters, 3 numbers. And it took 3 or 4 days to finally start finding valid Azure accounts when we were going after their Azure AD for password spraying. But when we did finally find it, their password policy was awful. So we were able to actually start getting valid accounts and valid credentials using that method. Now, the reason this falls in active recon, you are going to have to download the hosted files. So I've only been burned on it once during a red team, but a huge number of requests for hosted files can start tipping off, a blue team who's really paying attention. So there's a couple different ways of looking at the file metadata. If you want to look at automated, once you have or you can actually download and scan the files using Power Meta by Daft Hack, Bo Bullock over at Black Hills. And then there's also the tool FOCA by 11 Paths. Now, what these tools are doing, they search Google and Bing for docs, spreadsheets, PDFs. Once you've pulled all those documents down, it goes through the metadata and just pulls out every field in the metadata and extracts it to a spreadsheet. And again, you can kind of look through there, look for, username patterns, look for the operating systems in use, that kind of thing. And then you can do manual file metadata. You can use Google and Bing search dorks, like search for particular file types. This company is hosting a lot of PDFs, so insight, target name, and then file type PDF. And then use add-ons like Link Clipper or download them all. And actually just go through page by page, just grabbing as many files from those search engines as you can. We've had, where you can find results of files that were posted originally 20, 30 years ago, but they still have just as much metadata in them as the files do nowadays. And then you can use, you can just create a for loop in Linux to download with wget or curl. Excuse me, again, if you're trying to fly under the radar, I'd put a sleep between each of those requests. And maybe change your user agent to look more like a regular web crawler or like a regular web browser. And then the extract metadata is a function built into the Power Meta from Daft Hack that I mentioned earlier. You just run the PowerShell script against it, and again, it spits out a CSV of all the metadata that was there. Something else that you can do, especially if you find a client who is still hosting their own Microsoft NTLM authentication endpoints, is you can grab the internal domain name. So if they're hosting an on-prem Active Directory Federation site, they use domain/username for authentication. And most of the ADFS sites that I've come across, if you just put invalid credentials in there, they have JavaScript that will pop up and say, hey, you're supposed to use this domain name / this username. But they also have a ton of NTLM authentication endpoints that are on by default. So if you send an NTLM authentication request to this endpoint, within the response from the server, it'll actually have the internal host name, the internal domain name, and any kind of other information, such as like what kind of username. Sometimes it'll tell you what kind of username it's expecting. Nowadays, most of the ADFS is actually hosted through Azure, but a lot of companies who are still hosting their own ADFS, this is a huge thing to go after if you see it during your recon. Also, another one is Outlook Web Access. Again, these are kind of falling by the wayside as more and more companies move to Office 365. But again, you just throw a single NTLM authentication request to it, and then base64 decode the response, and it'll have all of the same things that the ADFS site would have. On a lot of pen tests that I did a few years back, this was usually the most often the way that we'd get the internal domain name through the request. We'd start brute forcing usernames using NTLM timing attacks. And then once we kind of compiled a list, we would just set a thing so that we would kind of coordinate with the client, figure out what their password policy lockout observation window was, and then set a loop with just a huge list of common passwords like password 1, season, year, that kind of thing. Start looping through until we got valid accounts. And then you could use things in Outlook Web Access to set up rules that would give you remote code execution, and we would turn our external into an internal. Another way you can kind of pull this all down, there is an automated Metasploit module that will output the information a little cleaner than the manual methods, but it is out there if that makes it easier. And then one of the final things we do when we're doing active recon, we do third-party port scanning. We use things like GeekFlare, T1 Shopper, IPv6 Scanner. Hacker Target is the company that's involved with DNS Dumpster and Shodan. So all of these services can be used to perform port scans against your client, while not tipping them off that you are the one coming after them. So they don't see some random DigitalOcean node coming after them. They see a service that's usually crawling the internet and looking at things that they're doing. So this may help you fly under the radar a little bit. But again, especially depending on the speed of the scan, this can definitely be a red flag that to the blue team that either a test is going on or, they've got something worse coming down the line. And so to summarize, a large part of the recon requires zero interaction with the target. That's pretty much the nature of open source intelligence. This is pretty much just going to your search engines or these third-party aggregators and pulling down just a huge wealth of information. But, on top of that, the target organizations often provide a wealth of information too, through file metadata, through their blog posts that they're posting, and through things that their employees are sharing on social media. Now, automated recon is always going to be faster, but with manual, you can definitely, like I was saying earlier, throw those sleeps in between requests. Make sure that you're not kind of tipping the scale to let the blue team know that they're currently under attack. And then we recommend defense should always perform these same recon steps to detect and remove any unnecessary exposures. The biggest thing is make sure that that you're kind of one step ahead of anybody who may be kind of trying to build a picture of what your organization does and what kind of avenues they have to attack you. So the next slide, we have a series of blog posts on our website, basically walking through a lot of these things with the commands and a little bit of relevant output. Because I know the slides here were a little bland, but for the most part, The blog post will walk you through a lot easier, especially with specific commands you can run for each tool. And that's it. Did anybody have any questions? See, looks like Arcane said definitely going to need these slides later. So on the first page of the thing, we actually have an automated thing that will download the slides for you if you go to this website. It's redsiege.com/haystack. Let me throw a link to that in here. That should take you straight to kind of straight to the slides. Which I'm pretty sure they're in PDF format. But if you have any trouble with getting a hold of the tool or have any questions about it, definitely reach out. Gen 3 asks, how do you organize all the things you find during Recon? So typically, I'm using, especially when we're working on a team, we make a folder ahead of time so that we've got, all right, this is everything we got on infrastructure. So we put out CSVs, text files, that kind of thing. And then once we've kind of compiled everything, we usually create a spreadsheet that says, all right, here's all the IP addresses, ASNs, hosts, that kind of thing. And we make the spreadsheet with also all the email addresses and employee names, and we send that to the client and we say, hey, is there anything on here we definitely shouldn't be touching, or is any of this information inaccurate? Because we want to make sure we're not just completely hammering something that's out of scope. And then let's see. Hey, thank you. I don't see any other questions. Somebody had mentioned Dehashed. Yeah, so what Dehashed does is they've made a huge searchable database for all of these password leaks that they get their hands on. Now, by owning this information, it's definitely a gray area in security, but we do, like to think we are authorized to be in possession of this information because we're going after a client, and we are authorized to be using this information. So that's kind of where we stand on, using these third-party services, but we're also here to emulate attackers. So we are, we use anything that we have at our disposal within reason. But the great thing about Dehash too, they have an API, so you can actually send a request with your API key to Dehashed, and it'll spit back a JSON file with all of the results that they had in their database. And if you pipe it to a tool like JQ, it'll actually format it so it's very easy to grep after that. Yeah, agreed, Killabees. We are here to emulate adversaries, so we try to use anything that's at our disposal, again, within reason. All right, well, thanks everyone for coming out to the talk. And as always, we do talks like this pretty regularly from our company. So if you're interested, come check out the website. It's got all the information about the Wednesday Offensive and the monthly Siegecast that we do.